I drove 3 hours through Georgia rain to watch my father cut a ribbon. That was the only plan. Show up, sit somewhere near the back, clap when everyone else clapped, and leave before dessert. Then I heard Linda's voice floating through the hospital lobby like perfume nobody asked for. Oh, Rachel tried medicine for a while. Bless her heart. It just wasn't for her. She laughed. Someone laughed with her. I kept walking. The thing about small towns in Georgia is they don't forget. They archive. Every mistake, every rumor, every version of you that someone else decided to tell it all gets filed away and pulled out at church potlucks and ribbon cuttings like dusty yearbooks nobody asked to see. Savannah Memorial Hospital looked different than I remembered. Bigger. A new wing stretched out from the east side, all glass and polished stone, with my father's name etched above the entrance in letters tall enough to read from the parking lot. The Montgomery Cardiac Center. His money. His legacy. Tonight, the dedication ceremony would fill the atrium with donors, physicians, city council members, and my stepmother's carefully constructed version of our family. I parked far from the entrance because I needed the walk. Rain had stopped, but the air still carried that wet earth smell that makes Georgia feel ancient and slow. My shoes hit the pavement in a rhythm I recognized, measured, deliberate, the pace of someone who'd spent years walking hospital corridors where urgency hid behind composure. I should have stayed at the hotel. I should have sent flowers and a card with something safe written inside. Congratulations, Dad. Proud of you. But coming home meant looking people in the eye. And I owed him that much even if he didn't know what I actually owed him. The lobby smelled like fresh paint and lilies. A welcome banner hung between 2 columns, celebrating excellence in cardiac care. Beneath it, a photo of my father shaking hands with the hospital director, both men smiling the way men smile when money and reputation align perfectly. A woman at the reception table glanced up. Name? Rachel Kent. She scanned the list, finger trailing slowly. Her eyes flickered with something recognition, maybe curiosity. Oh, you're Thomas's daughter. I am. She handed me a name tag with the careful hesitation of someone who'd heard things. Enjoy the evening. I pressed the tag onto my jacket and walked inside. The atrium had been transformed, round tables draped in white, centerpieces with magnolias and candles, a stage at the far end where a podium waited under soft light. String quartet in the corner playing something elegant enough to impress but quiet enough to talk over. Linda's fingerprints were everywhere, the color scheme, the seating chart, the printed programs stacked in neat rows like little monuments to her organizational ambition. She had always been good at turning other people's accomplishments into her own production. I picked up a program. Inside, my father's biography filled 2 pages: education, career, philanthropy, community involvement. Under family, it read, Thomas Kent is supported by his devoted wife, Linda, and is a proud father. No name, just father. I set the program down. The crowd was already thick with the kind of people who attend hospital galas, doctors in blazers trying to look relaxed, board members whose smiles never quite reached their eyes, local politicians working the room like it was election season. I recognized faces from years ago, older now, but carrying the same polite suspicion small towns specialize in. Rachel? A woman touched my arm. Mrs. Alderman, my father's neighbor, for 20 years. Her face performed surprise the way a stage actress might wide eyes, hand on chest. Hi, Mrs. Alderman. Well, look at you. It's been ages. Her gaze swept over me quickly, cataloging details she'd report later. What are you doing these days, honey? There it was. The question that carried Linda's fingerprints. I'm working up in Baltimore. Oh, her smile tightened. That's nice. Your father mentioned you were doing something with clinics? Clinics. The word landed with practiced diminishment. Not hospitals. Not surgery. Clinics. The kind of word Linda would use to make something sound smaller than it was. Something like that, I said. Mrs. Alderman patted my arm the way people pat things they feel sorry for. Well, good for you, sweetheart. Your father's so proud tonight. She drifted away before I could respond, which was fine. I didn't have a response that would fit inside her assumptions anyway. I found a seat near the back corner, half hidden by a pillar. From there I could see the stage, the entrance, and most of the room without becoming part of it. Old habit. In my world, observation was a professional skill. Here, It was survival. Linda appeared 20 minutes before the program was scheduled to start, entering the atrium like a woman arriving at her own coronation. Navy dress, pearl earrings, hair sculpted into the kind of elegant wave that required 2 hours and absolute certainty that you deserved the effort. She moved through the crowd with gravitational confidence, touching arms, accepting compliments, redirecting conversations toward my father with the precision of someone who understood that reflected glory was still glory. My father walked beside her, tall and silver-haired. He shook. I watched him scan the room once, quickly, the way you check for something you're not sure you want to find. His eyes passed over my corner without stopping. Either he didn't see me or he chose not to, and I had long since stopped trying to tell the difference. Linda spotted me first. Of course she did. Her radar for anything that might disrupt her narrative was military grade. She crossed the room with that particular walk, unhurried but purposeful. The kind that says, "I'm coming to you because I choose to, not because you matter." Rachel. She stretched my name the way she always did, turning 2 syllables into something that sounded like a sigh. "You came." I did. Her eyes dropped to my outfit. Black blazer, simple blouse, dark pants, professional, unremarkable, deliberately so. She said, as if my clothes had personally offended her. "I suppose that's fine for the back tables. I'm comfortable here. Your father's been asking about you." The way she said it implied the asking was a burden she'd been managing on his behalf. "He worries. He doesn't need to." Linda tilted her head, studying me with the expression of someone examining a stain they couldn't quite identify. "You know," she said, lowering her voice to that weaponized whisper she'd perfected over the years, "people are going to ask what you're doing now, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't make things complicated." "Complicated how?" "You know how." Her smile was porcelain smooth, decorative, hollow. "Just let tonight be about your father. That's why I'm here." She held my gaze for a moment longer, searching for resistance. When she found none, satisfaction softened her features. "Good. Oh, and Rachel, Dr. Whitmore is here. Chair of the hospital board. Very important man. If he talks to you, just..." She waved a hand vaguely. "Keep it simple." She turned and glided back toward the crowd, already redirecting her attention to someone more useful. I sat with her words settling around me like dust. Keep it simple. In Linda's vocabulary, that meant keep it small. Keep yourself small. Don't complicate the picture I've painted. It had been this way for 12 years. Since my father married her when I was 19, Linda had appointed herself the family's editor, deciding which details deserved publication and which should be quietly buried. When I'd left Georgia for medical school, she'd told neighbors I was trying something out up north. When I'd matched into one of the most competitive surgical residencies in the country, she'd described it as Rachel's little hospital job. When I'd stopped coming home because the cost of correction had grown higher than the cost of absence, she'd crafted the definitive version. Rachel couldn't handle it. She dropped out. She works at some walk-in clinic now. Bless her heart, my father never corrected her. Not because he believed it entirely, but because believing it was easier than asking questions whose answers might require him to confront the woman sleeping beside him. Thomas Kent was a generous man, a respected man, but he was also a man who had chosen peace over truth so many times that he could no longer tell the difference. Across the room, I saw him accept a glass of champagne from a server, his free hand resting on Linda's back. She whispered something, and he nodded. They looked like a portrait of a successful couple. And portraits, I'd learned, were just lies with better lighting. The program began with the hospital director taking the stage. Warm applause, polished remarks about legacy and community. My father was introduced with the kind of reverence reserved for men who write large checks. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the podium with the measured stride of someone who had waited his whole life for exactly this kind of evening. Linda watched from the front row, eyes bright with possessive pride. This was her production, her husband, her moment. I stayed in my corner, invisible by design. Halfway through the director's remarks, the atrium doors opened. The movement was subtle enough that most people didn't notice. But I did, because the man who entered moved the way certain people move with a weight that has nothing to do with size and everything to do with authority. Dr. Marcus Webb. I recognized him before he was 10 steps inside. Silver-haired, sharp-eyed, the kind of face medical journals put on covers, not because it was handsome, but because it radiated competence so intensely it bordered on intimidation. He wore a dark suit with a small lapel pin, the insignia of the American College of Surgeons, and he carried himself like a man who had spent 40 years saving lives and had stopped being impressed by ribbon cuttings somewhere. Around year 5, the hospital director noticed him mid-sentence and nearly fumbled his notes. And well, we're especially honored tonight to welcome a very distinguished guest. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in recognizing Dr. Marcus Webb, Chief of Surgery at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and a pioneer in pediatric cardiac care. Applause erupted, louder and more genuine than anything that had come before. People turned in their seats, whispers rippled outward. Linda's expression shifted surprise, dissolving rapidly into calculation. A man like Webb at her husband's ceremony was social currency she hadn't anticipated, and she was already mentally spending it. My father rose halfway from his seat, stunned and flattered. Dr. Webb raised a hand in polite acknowledgement to the crowd, smiling briefly. Then he began walking through the atrium, accepting handshakes and nods from people who suddenly seemed smaller in his presence. Linda stood, smoothing her dress, positioning herself for introduction. She whispered something to my father. He straightened his tie. But Dr. Webb's trajectory wasn't pointing toward the stage. It wasn't pointing toward my father. His eyes had caught something in the back of the room, and his path shifted subtly at first, then unmistakably away from the dignitaries, away from the front row, toward the corner near the pillar where I sat alone. The first person to notice was a young surgeon 3 tables from me. His fork stopped halfway to his mouth, then the woman next to him, then the table behind them. A wave of confused attention rolling backward through the room like a tide reversing. Linda saw it. I watched realization cross her face in stages: curiosity, confusion, alarm. Dr. Webb stopped in front of me. I stood, and then he did something that made every conversation in that atrium die simultaneously. He extended his hand with the formality reserved for colleagues, not strangers, not guests, not a woman who worked at some walk-in clinic. "Dr. Kent," he said, voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight." The name landed like a detonation. Dr. Kent. Not Rachel. Not Thomas's daughter. Dr. Kent. I took his hand. "Dr. Webb, it's good to see you." The feeling is mutual. He held the handshake a beat longer than casual, the way surgeons do when they're signaling respect to the room. "I read your paper on neonatal aortic reconstruction last month. Your team's outcomes are extraordinary. Thank you. That means a great deal coming from you." He released my hand but didn't step back. "I've been telling the board at Hopkins that you're doing work that's going to redefine the field." He paused, then added with a warmth that felt deliberate. "Youngest chief of pediatric surgery at Massachusetts General. We tried to recruit you 3 times. 3 times. He said it loudly enough that the nearest tables caught every syllable. Somewhere behind him, a glass clinked against a table. Someone inhaled audibly. The string quartet had stopped playing, and nobody seemed to notice. I felt the room rearrange itself around me, not physically, but socially, structurally. Every assumption, every whispered version of my story, every bless her heart recalibrating in real time. My father stood at his table, champagne glass frozen in midair. His face had gone completely blank, the way faces go when the brain is processing something it cannot reconcile with everything it thought it knew. Beside him, Linda had turned to stone. Not graceful stone, not composed stone. The brittle kind that cracks if you breathe on it. "Doctor." Webb turned slightly, acknowledging the room with a surgeon's calm. "Forgive me for monopolizing your guest of honor's daughter." He glanced toward my father. "You must be incredibly proud, Mr. Kent. Your daughter is one of the most gifted surgeons in the country." The sentence floated across the atrium like a blade made of silk. My father opened his mouth. Nothing came out. He closed it, tried again. His lips formed my name, but the sound didn't follow. Linda recovered first. She always did. Her smile reassembled itself faster than natural, tighter than convincing, and she stepped forward with her hand already extended. "Dr. Webb, what a pleasure. I'm Linda, Thomas's wife. We are just so thrilled you could join us tonight." She gestured toward me with performative warmth. "And yes, Rachel's always been so. Determined. The word did heavy lifting, implying stubbornness rather than excellence. Dr. Webb looked at her, not unkindly, but with the clarity of a man who spent his career reading vital signs. "Determined is one word," he said evenly. "Brilliant is the one I'd use." Linda's smile froze. Not the polite freeze of social discomfort, the deep freeze of a woman whose narrative was being surgically removed in public. Around us, conversations restarted in fragments. Quiet, stunned, electric. "Chief of surgery," someone whispered 3 tables away. "At Mass General? She's 31. I thought she dropped out. Who told you that?" The last question hung in the air, and I didn't have to look at Linda to know where every eye in the room was turning. A young resident at a nearby table stood awkwardly, then sat, then stood again, unsure of protocol but certain he'd just witnessed something seismic. 2 board members exchanged glances loaded with recalculation. The hospital director at the podium adjusted his glasses, script completely abandoned. My father finally moved. He set his champagne glass down with the careful deliberation of a man trying not to shatter anything else, and walked toward me. The crowd parted for him not out of respect for the evening's honoree, but out of instinct, the way people clear a path for someone walking into a truth they've been avoiding. He stopped 2 feet from me. His jaw worked. His eyes were glassy. "Rachel." "Hi, Dad." The informality seemed to break something in him. Not dramatically, there was no theatrical collapse, no movie moment embrace, just a small fracture in the composure he'd maintained for so long that he'd forgotten it was a mask. "Chief of Pediatric Surgery," he said, like he was reading the words off a wall he'd never noticed. "Yes." "At Mass General." "Yes." He blinked. Swallowed. "How long?" 2 years as chief. 8 years at the hospital. The math was brutal. 8 years. His daughter had been operating on the hearts of children for 8 years while he'd been told she couldn't handle the pressure. While Linda had rewritten the story so many times, she probably believed her own version. "You never told me," he whispered. "I told you I was a surgeon in Boston. Every time we spoke." His face crumpled slightly. "You said you were working at a hospital." "I was. I am," Linda said. He stopped himself. The sentence was already too heavy to finish. Linda materialized beside him, hand on his arm, voice wrapped in the particular sweetness she deployed when the ground shifted beneath her. "Thomas, honey, let's not do this here." She gave a tinkling laugh. Dr. Webb probably exaggerated. You know how people talk at these events. Dr. Webb, who had stepped aside to speak with a colleague, turned at the sound of his name. His expression was polite, but his eyes had sharpened. "I don't exaggerate, Mrs. Kent." 4 words, delivered with the quiet authority of a man who'd spent decades speaking in operating rooms where precision was the difference between life and death. Linda's hand tightened on my father's arm. "Well," she said, the brightness in her voice cracking at the edges. "I'm sure Rachel's done very well for herself. We just didn't get all the details." "You didn't ask for them," I said. The sentence was quiet. It wasn't angry. It didn't need to be, because truth, when it's simple enough, doesn't require volume. My father looked at me, then at Linda, then back at me. I could see the years replaying behind his eyes, every phone call where he'd asked polite, surface-level questions and accepted Linda's interpretation of my vague answers. Every holiday I'd stopped attending. Every silence he'd filled with the story that required less effort to believe. "Rachel," he said again, voice raw. "I didn't know. You knew I was a doctor. You knew I was in Boston. You chose which parts to believe." The accusation wasn't aimed at him alone, and everyone in that atrium felt it. Linda's composure cracked. "I was trying to protect this family from embarrassment." "Whose embarrassment?" my father asked. The question was so simple and so devastating that Linda physically stepped back. Her hand dropped from his arm. For the first time in 12 years, I saw her without a script, without a social maneuver, without a prepared smile. Just a woman standing inside the collapse of a story she'd spent a decade constructing. "Everything I told people," she started, voice climbing. "I told them because you never said anything clear. You were always vague, always secretive." "I was private," I said. "There's a difference. Private looks a lot like failure when no one's explaining otherwise." "That was your job," I replied. "You took it. You chose what to explain. And you chose wrong." The room had gone silent again. Not the stunned silence from before something heavier, The silence of people witnessing a reckoning they suspected was overdue. My father's shoulders dropped. Not defeat, release. Like a man finally exhaling after years of holding his breath without realizing it. "I owe you an apology," he said. Yes, he flinched at the directness. But he didn't retreat. I let someone else tell me who my daughter was. And I believed it because it was easier than digging. The honesty was so raw it felt like surgery, precise, painful, necessary. Linda's eyes darted between us, calculating diminishing options. "Thomas, you can't seriously—" "I can," he said quietly. "And I should have done this years ago." Something shifted in the room. Not physically, but the social architecture of the evening rotated on its axis. My father was no longer the centerpiece. Linda was no longer the conductor. The ribbon cutting, the dedication, the champagne, all of it receded behind a truth that had walked in uninvited and refused to leave. Dr. Webb approached my father one last time, extending his hand. "Mr. Kent, congratulations on the cardiac center. It will do tremendous good." He paused. "And for what it's worth, your daughter saved the life of my colleague's 3-year-old granddaughter last year. A surgery no one else would attempt." My father took his hand but couldn't speak. His eyes were wet. The ceremony resumed eventually, the way all ceremonies do, with polite determination and the quiet agreement to pretend normalcy. The director finished his remarks. My father cut the ribbon. Applause came, sincere but complicated, because the audience had witnessed 2 dedications that evening. One to a building, and one to a truth that had been buried under years of polished lies. Linda stood beside my father for the photographs. Smile intact, posture impeccable. But her eyes were different now. Something behind them had gone dark, like a house where someone had finally turned off the lights. People approached me afterward, cautiously at first, then with growing warmth. "Dr. Kent, we had no idea. Your father must be so proud. Mass General, that's extraordinary." I accepted each comment with the same composure that had carried me through 16-hour surgeries and impossible diagnoses. Gracious, measured, revealing nothing extra. Because the point had never been to humiliate Linda. The point had been to exist honestly in a room that had been fed fiction. Outside, the Georgia night had cleared. Stars sharp enough to cut. Air thick with magnolia and cooling rain. I walked to the parking lot alone, keys in hand, ready to begin the drive back to a life that didn't require anyone's permission to be real. My father found me by my car. No Linda. Just him, jacket unbuttoned, looking older than he had an hour ago. "Rachel." I turned. He stood under a parking lot light, hands in his pockets. A man stripped of everything but regret and the fragile beginning of something honest. "I missed it," he said. "All of it. Your graduation, your residency, your appointment. I missed everything that mattered because I was listening to the wrong person. You were listening to the person who was loudest." He winced. "That's worse." "It is." A long silence. Crickets. A distant car alarm. The mundane sounds that fill the spaces between things that matter. "Can we start over?" he asked. "We can't start over. We can start from here." He nodded slowly, absorbing the distinction. "I'd like that. Then start by knowing me. Not Linda's version of me. Not the town's version. Me." His chin trembled. "I want to. Wanting isn't enough. You have to choose it. Every day. Even when it's uncomfortable." He stepped forward and pulled me into a hug. Awkward, unpracticed, the embrace of a man who hadn't held his daughter in years and wasn't sure he still had the right. But real. Unmistakably real. "I'm proud of you," he said into my shoulder, voice cracking. "I'm so damn proud of you, and I'm sorry it took a stranger telling me the truth for me to hear it." I closed my eyes. Not because the words fixed anything, they didn't. Years don't reverse in a parking lot, but because they were honest. And honesty from my father had become so rare that receiving it felt like finding something I'd stopped searching for. I pulled back. "Go deal with Linda." His jaw tightened. "I will. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He nodded. The agreement sat between us, heavy with implication. I got in my car. He stood in the parking lot watching me pull away, hands still in his pockets, porch light of the hospital glowing behind him like a lighthouse marking the edge of the life he thought he understood. The highway stretched north, dark, open, familiar. I drove without music, letting the silence fill the car the way it always did after something irreversible. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter. The particular calm that comes after truth has been spoken into a room that spent years avoiding it. Revenge, if you want to call it that, hadn't arrived as destruction. It arrived as correction. As a handshake from a man who respected my work. As a title spoken clearly into a room full of people who'd been given a different story. As my father's face when the distance between what he'd believed and what was real became impossible to ignore. Linda would recover. Women like her always do. She'd rewrite the evening by morning a misunderstanding, an exaggeration, a daughter who always had to make everything about herself. The narrative machine would restart, quieter maybe, but persistent. But something had cracked that couldn't be uncracked. My father had heard truth from a source he couldn't dismiss, and the sound of it had broken through 12 years of carefully maintained fiction. What he did with that, whether he rebuilt or retreated, was his choice now. I had given him the raw material. The architecture was up to him. I crossed the state line just past midnight. Georgia disappeared behind me, beautiful and complicated, and carrying my name in a version I no longer needed to correct. Because the people who mattered now knew, and the people who didn't would talk regardless, the way small towns always do. Except now the story had changed. And if there's anything worth carrying from a night like that, it's this. Silence is not emptiness. Patience is not surrender. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who've underestimated you is simply stand there and let the truth walk in on its own.